in financial affairs. Nival lahain ish ra'ayin v'lo yeda ki chaser yivienu. Shlomo HaMelech tells us, Nival lahain, people who are get tumult, lahain, because they want to have a hain, they want to be wealthy. Ish ra'ayin, it leads people to do dishonest things. What leads to it? When you're hungry for wealth. If someone's hungry for wealth, ish ra'ayin, he ends up doing the wrong things. V'lo yeda ki chaser yivienu. And he's not smart enough to know that when you start down the road of dishonesty, ki chaser yivienu, the end is that you're going to be a chaser. More often than not, the road which begins with someone who wants to be rich and does the wrong things, and it could be gets away with it for a while. At the end, ki chaser yivienu, he ends up losing by the deal. Because that's the way the world works. Somebody who's too hungry, and first he steals something that he can get away with. Eventually, he steals something that he can't get away with. And at the end, ki chaser yivienu, he ends up losing. And this is just the way it works out in this case. Had they started off honestly, had they started off correctly, it would have been a different story. For today's time and age, it's such an important lesson to learn, because we live in a society that pursues wealth, and unfortunately we hear in our own circles among frum people stories of dishonesty. Someone just told me he doesn't understand how someone who's dishonest, how does he get up the next day and stand Shemoneh Esrei? How does he stand in front of the Rabbeinu Shalom? If he's making his money dishonestly, society rubs off on people. It doesn't start off with someone who decides, I wasn't sure which career I wanted, if I'll be a doctor or a businessman, I'll be a thief. Nobody decides to be a thief. They start with something that's gray, something that's not so clear. They start with disrespect for other people's things. And it's a road which leads to calamity. It leads to dishonesty, and ultimately it leads to a person ending up in a disaster himself. Rabbi Yaakov used to say, the minig was always that with children who start learning Gemara, you learn Elu Metzia Shalai ve'Elu Chayav L'Hachris. When I was in yeshiva, that was the first thing we learned. Gemara, Perek Elu Metzias, these Metzias are yours, these Yechayav L'Hachris. And what do we learn? We learn about the Mois Mefuzarais and Peirais Mefuzarais. And why? Why start with that? Today, there's some yeshivas start with brachas. It's Negei Amor. Who finds Mois Mefuzarais, Peirais Mefuzarais? Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky used to say, if I cared, start a child off by teaching him that you have to be honest with money. And where society tells you that finders, keepers, losers, weepers, Chazal tell us, you find something, you have an achrayus. You have to know the halacha. Sometimes it's yours, sometimes it's not. It was over a story, an emes ma'ase that happened in Eretz Yisrael. A fellow from a family, a Freya American family, and the children, they wanted to pursue ruchnius. They had a hunger for spirituality. An older brother ended up in Eretz Yisrael, in aish hatorah, Baal Tshuva. He had a younger brother who was searching the world. He was already in India looking for the gurus. His brother begged him to try aish hatorah. He wouldn't come. He told him, I'll give you a free ticket to come to Eretz Yisrael for a week, on the condition you go to one class in aish hatorah. A free ticket, he couldn't resist. Well, one class, let's live through one class. So he comes to Eretz Yisrael for a week, and he goes all the sightseeing, everything he wants to see. Fine, it's the end of the week. No, you promised one class. Fine. So he goes over to the bulletin board, he tries to pick out a class. Nebuch, this guy went along. So he looks at the titles, he doesn't know Hebrew. So he has someone to translate the title. So one of the titles was, Hilchas HaShavas Aveda. So he says, what does that mean? He says, returning lost things. So he thinks to himself, returning your lost heritage, returning your lost soul. These are the type of things he's into. Returning the old heritage, a lost soul. So he goes to class. He sits down in the class. And a yeshiva man walks in, sits down. And it seems he was in the middle of teaching these. He starts darshaning to them. If you find coins in the street, when do you return it? If it's piled up, the smaller one on top of the bigger one, then it means it's derech hanocha, you have to put it back. If you find it spread out, you don't have to put it back. He starts talking about poppy seeds. If it's poppy seeds spread out over dalit damis, then you have to return it. If the poppy seeds are... So this fellow fell asleep in the middle of class. Poppy seeds and this. And the person started getting into all kinds of details about finding things which you'll never find in a million years. And if you find poppy seeds in the street, you pick up the poppy seeds. You go weiter anyway. They couldn't understand. So he came back after, he went back to India. No, end of story. Not the end of the story. About a month later, this man comes back to Eretz Yisrael. This person says, what are you doing here? He says, you remember that class in aish hatorah? He says, oh, that disaster, I told you 100 times, you went to the wrong class, they're not all that way. He says, I went back to my guru in India. And last week we were walking, from whatever it is, from the temple back to the dormitory, and there was a wallet. The fellow, my guru, picks up a wallet, and the wallet was crammed with money, and it had someone's name in it. And the guru puts it into his pocket, and he says some type of proverb, which is the Indian equivalent of finders keepers, losers weepers. So he says, my gosh, the rabbi in Jerusalem is telling me that if I find poppy seeds, I have to take my ruler and figure out if it's spread over dalit amis, whatever that means. And here he takes a wallet and he puts it in his own pocket, and he headed back to Yerushalayim. Isn't that a nice story? Isn't that the way the story about Fruma Yidden should be? Let me tell you about the Swiss bank accounts. In Reichmans' biography, there's a story. There's a fellow, if I have his name right, by the name of Charlie Bentheim, who was a New Yorker, he lived here in New York. The reichmans had money before the war. They were stuck in Hungary when the war broke out. It was against the law to send money to the United States. And if you were caught, it was punishable. What they did is, one of the reichmans, is he sent out a bank check. He didn't want to put his name on it, it was illegal. But he sent out a bank check for a large amount of money. And he sent it to different people. And one of these people was this Charlie Bentheim. And this was told over because he passed away recently. And they were speaking about him, they told over this story. He receives a check in the mail for $75,000. Which is nice, I wouldn't mind getting it today. But in 1940, it was a lot of money. $75,000, a nice check. No return address. Post-dated, who knows, from Hungary. And here he is in New York. He takes the $75,000. He puts it away in a bank account. 5 years pass. 5 years later, the reichmans, after going through the war, finally make it back to New York. And they had, of course, the names of the people they sent their money to. He comes knocking on the Phillips brothers in the office where Charlie Bentheim worked. He tells his secretary, tell him that Mr. Reichman is here. Mr. Bentheim says, I never heard of Reichman. This, of course, is 50 years ago. Today, everyone heard of Reichman. Never heard, was this Reichman? Tell him he knows me. I'm the one who sent him the check 5 years ago. So this man comes out, Mr. Bentheim, without blinking an eyelash. He tells him, well, how'd you send it? He gives him a simon. It was a banknote written this and this way for exactly $75,000. And at the moment, he writes out a check, $75,000, gives it to him. I was holding your money all along. He gives it to him to take back. Now, the person I heard the story from, I asked him if he gave it to him back with interest or without interest. So I don't know. Al Pidin, maybe it's a Shaila and Ribbis. You have to look it up in the Ribbis book. But Al Kapanim, the bottom line, without batting an eyelash, he gave it to him back. And it seems from the story that he did this with a few people. He spread his money, and he came back, he got it from Yidden. Aren't these the stories we should be hearing about Yidden? Stories of honesty. Compare a Yid to a guy. Would a guy give back the money? Would a guy give back the money? It bothered me very much. The other day, I tried to call Eretz Yisroel using my calling card. I tried to get through, so the operator says it doesn't go through. I said, it's the right calling card number. I was in yeshiva. I wasn't home. I was using someone else's phone. I wasn't going to use the yeshiva's phone. I tried to call Eretz Yisroel. Doesn't go through. Finally, she says, oh, I got up on the computer why it doesn't come through. It seems that AT&T does not allow calling card calls. They allow it to anywhere in the world except Eretz Yisrael and Puerto Rico because of a high incidence of fraud to these two countries. Isn't that a bizayon? Isn't that a bizayon for Yidden? And punkt, our luck, we have to be mishudach with the Puerto Ricans. It's a person has to have the right mentality. This mentality, the integrity that's needed. It should be such a nice thing to contrast what's going to happen with the Swiss. And this is money, not of individuals, of companies, where they've been lying 50 years later, they're still hiding it. And Yidden will write out a check and give it back. Rav Yisroel